to welcome each and every one of you to the first of our 4 webinars, which will precede and also culminate in our media ethics conference next month. I know that this is an awkward hour, 3 p.m., but I think that the excitement for me meant that I had to put everything aside, and I thought it important to also be part of this particular webinar and to also open it. My name is Bungalwa. I'm the current chairperson of SANEF. And as we're meeting here today, discussing these 2 important themes. One where we're looking at the issue of disinformation and misinformation. I think it's actually quite accurate and an important one, because I believe that part of the threat that we face in terms of the sustainability of the media is not just about declining revenues or declining ad spend for media publications and also COVID-19. Yes, those are big factors, but I think and I do believe that the spread and the proliferation of disinformation is actually a direct threat to the sustainability of our industry. So it is important that as SANEF and as also as the various stakeholders who are here today, that we thresh these issues out and we discuss some of these issues. And perhaps, as we said when we released the report, that came from the panel that was led by Judge Setchwell, that we want to draft a 5-year action plan on ethics that will guide us as we go along, as we try to also restore the trust that we may have lost as the media, and also bridge that deficit, then the schism that exists between us and some of our audiences. I believe that this conference is, in fact, this webinar, being one of 4 is actually important for us as we get to that point. And as you would know, some of you, that we're also conducting some research which looks into particularly the issue of media sustainability, but it looks at also some of the themes of the issues that we're discussing today that deal with. I'm excited to be here, and I thought it important that because this is the first of our 4 webinars, that I come here and welcome all of you here. And my colleague, Monica Laganparsad, will be the one who will moderate this discussion, but also to say that I'd like to welcome everyone here. She will introduce our esteemed panelists. I'm pleased to see some of you, and all of you who are here today. Monica and I go back a while back. I see that in her bio, she left out the fact that we worked at independent newspapers at some point and spent many years in Durban, and also at Avusa, which is now known as an Arena. But Monica is currently the associate editor at New Frame, and she's originally from Durban and has worked at various publications, some of them which have the ones that I've mentioned, but she's also worked at News 24, and he has a keen interest on issues of law, but also more importantly, gender issues and gender parity. So without wasting any more time, colleagues, let me once again welcome you to this webinar, and say that we do hope that these deliberations from today, I look forward to your input, will actually enrich whatever action plan, whatever discussions that we will have at a later stage when we have our media ethics conference in the middle of next month. With that, thank you very much, and welcome once again. And Monica, over to you.
Good afternoon, colleagues. Thank you, Spoo, for that gracious introduction. Today we begin part 1 of our 4-part series, which considers building an ethical framework for South African journalism. To begin our investigation into the quality and ethical journalism, we consider the first topic from the twin perspective of the themes: media freedom, including dealing with misinformation and disinformation; media diversity, which includes counteracting racial and gender biases and prejudices, racism and sexism in the media. The aim of this webinar is to take the key recommendations to an upcoming May conference to be included in the official action plan. Before we move to the recommendations, I would like to introduce our esteemed panelists this afternoon, who have graciously joined us. We begin with Rich Mkhondo, who is a journalist, author, and SANEF Media Ethics and Credibility Inquiry Panel member. We have a veteran newspaperman, Joe Thloloe, who is also the former ombudsman, and Anthea Garman, Rhodes University professor. Thank you for being here this afternoon. As we move on, we will look at the key recommendations. We begin with media freedom. If you could please share that slide, thank you. Thank you very much. Media freedom. These are the bullet points that came out of the recommendations from the ethics inquiry. It's to collaborate with other media entities, encourage the commitment to independent media, participate in debates on a need for management and editorial independence, stimulate discussions on a unified organization for journalists, to continue to debate on journalism as a profession, to encourage individual instead of organizational sign up to the ethical codes, to draw up a media freedom declaration with a commitment from CSOs and government, and to foster debate on the role of media in democracy. Media diversity, to lobby for national media diversity mapping, to promote knowledge of all South African languages by media practitioners on all platforms, to lobby for news in African languages accessible to all South Africans, to study global best practices in extending diversity in both public and private media, to encourage alignment with the 1991 Windhoek Declaration, and to work with the Special Rapporteur for access to information. Thank you. Our first speaker this afternoon is Rich Mkhondo, who would like to set the scene and provide an overview of the report. Before I hand over to you, Rich, I would just like to remind all our speakers this afternoon to please keep it to 6 minutes. I will ensure that I'll be timekeeping, but please make sure you keep to that time limit. With that, I'd like to hand over to Rich. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Monica. My assumption is that everyone has had an opportunity to at least read or scan through the report which we put together. And I thought for me to stimulate discussion was to start with a quotation or an excerpt from a book by one of the best broadcasters in the world who I had an opportunity to meet when I was working in the US. And unfortunately, he passed away a few years ago, Jim Lehrer. When I was in Washington, I attended a sort of a media training session at the Center for Foreign Journalists in Virginia. And he was one of the speakers. And he read some parts of his book, which he was about to publish. But I think he was sort of prompted by one of the journalists who was there at the time, who asked him a question whether he has any guidelines for practicing journalism. He said, of course I do. And then he listed some of the guidelines. And these guidelines, I actually thought about them every time I was in a discussion with fellow journalists across the country when we were doing the inquiry. The first point that Jim Lehrer mentioned was, do nothing I cannot defend. This is very important. And he elaborated on why that was the case. My feeling here is that each one of us should actually consider that. Is a journalist allowed to do anything they cannot defend? Then the second point was cover, write, and present every story with the care I would want if the story were about me. I don't know if every journalist does think about that if you write something about someone, do you ever stop and think, what if this story was about me? The third one was, assume there is at least one other side or version to every story. do we really assume that there is a version of the other story rather than that what you're being told? The other one is assume the viewer is as smart and caring and as good a person as I am. Assume the same about all people to whom I report. That's very important. The other one is assume personal lives are a private matter until a legitimate turn in the story absolutely mandates otherwise. That's very important also for everyone to think about. Carefully, the other one is carefully separate opinion and analysis from straight news stories and clearly label everything. And the last ones are, do not use anonymous sources or blind quotes except on rare and monumental occasion. And lastly, no one should ever be allowed to attack another anonymously. So every time I sat in a panel with Kathy and Nikiwe, sometimes I wondered whether we still think about some of these guidelines, which actually we know and we know we should consider, because basically they are part of journalism 101.
I can't, I mean, I won't even be able to because she's not here. I have no clue.
Oh, someone is okay. That's fine. Let me continue. I was saying that whenever we were conducting the inquiry, I always ask myself similar question. But some of the issues that came during the discussion, which I think you know, and you've read about them, are very prominent. And in my analysis, I found that actually each media organization and each journalist gets affected by one or two greatly, or the same way, or maybe a little bit, but not much. For example, we know there are revenue challenges impacting on the sustainability of the media. This one came out very clearly. Journalists are under pressure because of their revenue challenges. We know that there are dwindling resources for professional development. This one also came out quite clearly that there's no longer any training any longer. So the newsroom is juniorized, and those who are there do not get trained or mentored. And then we know that there are lack of effective exercise of editorial and sub-editing to check the stories, to make sure that they are correct, to ask questions. This came out quite clearly in each of the newsroom that we visited. Each of the stories which were being criticized, most of the editors actually said they regretted that they didn't actually exercise editorial and sub-editing checks and balances. I remember the 3 hours we spent at the Sunday Times. These were some of the issues we discussed when we were talking about the two big stories of the Sunday Times, which they eventually had to apologize for them. They mentioned this issue of sub-editing checks and balances and so on. Then we know that the social media is putting pressure on journalists to move faster, to write stories. I remember my time as a journalist with Reuters. The issue of breaking stories was quite important. You could actually wait for your story for 2 hours or 3 hours before you could break it, even a day for that matter. But these days you can't, because it will be broken by social media. So people make sure that they break some of the rules. And hence, the topic of today is misinformation and disinformation. Misinformation and disinformation because that of lack of exercise of editorial control. Then, of course, there are also societal pressures. People who plant stories in the newsrooms because they want to get at their opponents. This is what Jim Lehrer was talking about. Then, of course, is the brown envelope phenomena. We saw at the weekend that one of the newspapers fired one of their journalists because he had been recorded asking for a 1 million rand bribe. I don't know whether to call it a bribe or payment. I think we could talk about that one. When we conducted the inquiry, we asked most of the people whether they were aware of the brown envelope phenomena. Most of them said they have heard about it, but they were not aware of it. And even those who were accused of receiving money, they actually said they were not aware of such things. We know of stories which have been written, particularly in Cape Town during 8 years ago. So maybe we could talk about that one. Then there's also the manipulation of reporters by people who want to get at people. We know about that. And then the political pressure and ownership pressure, so that they must actually maybe help with the revenue challenges. In the past, it used to be about circulation. I don't know what about it now. It's about clicking in online, in their online stories. And then, of course, there is the advent of international information platforms such as Facebook and Google and the others. These are some of the stuff that came during our discussion. Hence, Monica flighted some of the recommendations which are going to be discussed at the end. And then the last one, of course, was the issue of anonymous sources, which was a big debate also, because people protected the anonymous sources, and particularly the Sunday Times stories, where we asked the editor and the journalist himself exactly whether there was a debate over this issue. So the information I just shared with you, it's not new, and we know about it. My thinking is that each media organization, whether it is ENCA, whether it is independent newspapers or the Star, or whether it's News 24, they get affected by each one of them differently. If it's a question of revenue, then you're looking at the probability that you may have to close shop. And then the others come in, hence the issue of ethical lapses come into place. We can discuss during the discussion some of the anecdotes which came out during the inquiry itself. But all I want to say is my takeaway from this inquiry is that the journalism fraternity is facing difficult time as we speak. And the journalism fraternity is facing difficult times for the future. And it is difficult to know how the media industry is going to survive. Hence, there are all these shortcuts. Hence, there are all these issues that I have identified. When I last counted, there were about 10 of them. But I know that my colleagues could say, actually, there are more. There are more of those, but each one of them may actually affect one of the other. For example, the issue of the ownership structure and control, it's quite big, and it happens every now and then. You know that 2 months ago, ENCA was involved with criticism over this kind of issue, where there were issues of owners interfering in the reporting of the news, and therefore trying to prevent some of the news to be flighted because they may upset some of their political principles. And then, of course, the issue of dwindling resources, which many newspapers and television stations like SABC and others are facing as we speak. It is difficult to say all of them are responsible for ethical lapses and ethical problems, but we know that each one of them has an impact on ethics. I thought maybe I should just end there in the summary so that we could hear from my colleagues and discuss further some of the issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Rich. Thank you for that very thorough summary. I'd like to move on next to Brajo, who will provide top-level thought and insights into ethics and credibility in South African journalism. Thank you, Joe. I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, SANEF as a whole. Thank you, Rich, and your panel. And thank you for providing this platform for reflection and self-examination. But please allow me to take you back to what it felt like in 1996. Back to our excitement and joy that the new constitution included Section 16 in the Bill of Rights. Everyone has the right to freedom of expression, which includes freedom of the press and other media. When that constitution was promulgated in December 1996, we naively thought we had arrived. In truth, this should have marked the beginning of the revolution. Our work to liberate this country should have started there. Today, with a cell phone, a tablet, laptop, desktop, everyone is news editor, reporter, copy taster, sub-editor, and distributor. Our country has followed the rest of the world into these turbulent waters. Today, thanks to technology, society is poorer because of misinformation, disinformation, and media manipulation. Ladies and gentlemen, I have limited time to traverse long distances, so let me get straight to it. After spending more than half a decade in newsrooms, I disagree with the recommendation on the Chinese wall between editorial and management of publications. This wall is a myth that over centuries hasn't fooled anyone. The owners or owner invest their money for whatever reason to start a print or online publication, and they appoint an editor who agrees with their mission and vision. The editor, as a journalist, has his values welded to those of the owners, and it's his responsibility to ensure that in the meetings with the business management and the owners, those journalism values are not compromised. But as a reader, I'm confronted by one publication. It doesn't say this is from editorial, this is from business management. It's one publication that confronts me. Then as far as the recommendation A4 about trade unions in the media industry, it might sound strange coming from me, a person who spent a large part of his life organizing trade unions for journalists. But this recommendation goes beyond the competence of SANEF. Trade unions are voluntary associations, and journalists are free to start them, to join them, or stay away from them. Now, if journalists who are suffering from the effects of the current crisis in the industry choose to stay away from trade unions, they have the right to do so. Again, on recommendation A5, I again disagree with the notion that journalism is a profession. Journalists are also the everyone in Section 16 of the Constitution. They should exercise this right without violating other people's constitutional rights. On recommendation A6, that individuals rather than media houses subscribe and adhere to the ethical principles and standards, this needs to be thought through carefully. It's the media houses that have the powers to enforce the codes amongst the contributors, whether these are full-time staff or freelance. The individual is tied to the codes by virtue of contributing to a publication that is already a member. Perhaps media houses could make the codes part of their employment contracts and their freelance contracts. Now, in summarizing this area, I agree with the panel that the problem in the media reflects the problems of society as a whole, not just in South Africa, but all over the world. Now, if we consider a universe as a large circle, then those committed to good journalism would be just a small dot in that circle. Our goal should be to expand the dot until it is the universe, the large circle. This is slow, finicky effort that demands individual commitment. Quoting questions like those that Rich asked, why am I a journalist? Does my work inspire those around me, my fellow journalists, my readers, and society to emulate me? From my work, do my readers, listeners, or viewers understand the value of good journalism? Every word I write or every picture I take puts the value of journalism on the line. I'd like to add to the excellent recommendations by suggesting the following. 1, SANEF and media owners should push for a Inside Your Media campaign where editors and journalists talk with readers, listeners, and viewers in relaxed events coordinated by SANEF. 2, a similar campaign aimed at educational establishments that schools and universities should be run. 3, individual publications and SANEF should initiate media literacy blogs. These would be media conversations with society. 4, SANEF should lobby the Department of Education to include media literacy in their life skills syllabi, with emphasis on tools to ward off fake news, disinformation, and misinformation. 5, media houses have to invest in such tools and urge readers, viewers, and listeners to use them. In the end, a society gets the media it allows into its living rooms. We need to get people to scream, shout, and behead, fighting those who would limit the media. Every time there's an attack on the media, why are our millions of supporters so quiet? Somebody has information on the attack on the ENCA crew the other day. Those thugs came from us and live with us. As far as media diversity is concerned, may I add a suggestion that we add a survey and interviews with the minorities that ventured into the media business and then pulled out. I'm thinking of people like Saki Matozoma, Tokyo Suhwale. They remain surprisingly quiet in this debate about media diversity. As far as recommendation B12 and B11, these highlight another legacy from colonialism and apartheid. Everything from Europe or North America is best, whether it's the language, whether it's the dress, the music, the art, all the culture. Even our children can hardly speak African languages. Again, whatever our efforts, we should remember to ask ourselves how to get that dot to balloon and become our universe. Thank you.
Thank you, Brajo, for that insightful feedback. It is indeed a pleasure and an honor to have someone of your experience and your stature weigh in on this conversation. Your inputs are invaluable. Thank you. Our next speaker is Anthea Garman. Anthea offers a perspective into diversity issues and delivering opinions on gender diversity in newsrooms. Over to you, Anthea.
Thanks everybody for being here this afternoon, and thank you to SANEF and the panel for putting this range of really important considerations before us for a series of conversations and self-reflection, but also it's very good news to hear that SANEF is going to hold a conference on these issues. As I went through the report again, because I wanted to just figure out some things for myself, it's a very, very large report. And I think most of us were quite sort of struck by how much there was to say about the ethical situation that South African media has got itself into. But I want to actually divert a little bit. I'm not going to talk about gender issues in newsrooms. I'm going to say some things that I think that just are kind of on my heart and mind right now. And I'm going to pick up on a word used in the report, which is that the problems of the South African media are systemic. And I think that's an absolutely correct assessment by the panel. That the ethical lapses we see, the things that are egregious, as we've seen with the Sunday World very recently, Sunday World journalist, these are egregious things. But they speak of problems that are far more systemic in nature. And so I want to say two things, one on diversity and one on media freedom. On diversity, and this is where I'm going to diverge from talking about race and gender issues and so on. I think we have many, many conversations on those. But I think what I want to pick up on is the media ecosystem, the diversity of the media ecosystem of our land. And I am going to touch what Brajo said about in 1996, here we were given a constitution that protected freedom of expression for everybody, not just freedom for the media and freedom for journalists. So if you think about this population of ours and what they have access to in terms of good public interest media, we really need to take stock. We absolutely need to take very seriously media that needs to be in African languages. We need to take seriously the reach of media into the rural areas and into provinces that are way beyond our 3 or 4 very big cities in this country that dominate almost everything. We need to very seriously think about the cost of data and access. And I think the mapping study that the report has called for really needs to be done. And if we are going to think about an ecosystem that is far stronger, far richer, far more accessible, and that works in all the languages of our country, we need an overhaul of the system. We need an overhaul of the system that is not just about those kind of entities, those individual media entities, that immediately touches the finances and the support. So that's when I want to turn to the sort of second point I want to make today. The report makes a very strong call for public fund support of journalism. We were in dire straits before COVID hit. We are in even worse straits after COVID. We have got to have an entirely different relationship, I think, with the government of this country and with the regulators of the industry. The report talks quite a lot to the fact that the regulators work in distinct kind of relationships, to this part of the industry and that part of the industry, and far more need for the regulators to all talk to each other and to function properly. But it did sort of occur to me, because I've been involved in 2 other studies very recently. The one is an assessment of the South African government's own communication efforts during the COVID pandemic. So that meant talking to a lot of government departments, government communicators, media liaison people. And then the second project I've been involved in is one about sustainable journalism in sub-Saharan Africa. So conversations with particularly journalists in West Africa, Liberia, Ghana, and so on. So what occurs to me is that we don't have a very good relationship with our own government. The Ghanaian West African example shows that the media there is bedeviled by political interference, political and monopolistic, oligarchical sort of, media interests. We absolutely want a media free of that. So what we have done in contrast in South Africa is really go for private media and try to get as far away from any kind of government influence at all. But working on the second project, talking to people inside, government in communication, we really don't have a Department of Communication that understands public interest journalism in this country. The Department of Communication functions as, I don't know quite how to describe it, but as an entity that worries about, telephones and pipes and lines and who gets spectrum and that kind of technocratic sort of stuff. We don't have an entity inside our government that actually pays attention to rich, diverse, important communication. We have the MDDA, but the MDDA is not a functioning enough or big enough entity to take this problem on. So I'd like to put on the agenda, and I hope that this finds a sort of a home somewhere in somebody's heart and mind. That in fact, if we are to put in place a much better, robust ecosystem of media that serves the public of South Africa in a multiplicity of outlets and a multiplicity of languages right across the country, we are going to have to do some very hard systemic work. And the systemic work is going to have to be done in conjunction with all of us paying attention to this. But we are going to have conversations with our regulators and with whoever in government we can get to pay attention and to listen to us. So I'm going to just say that we can do things inside institutions, and we must. We can do things inside newsrooms, and we must. We can do things inside SANEF and bodies like SANEF that care about journalism. Absolutely, we must do that. But I think the report, among many other reports that have come out recently, like the one from Columbia University, Saving Journalism, Harry Dugmore's report, which is called Thinking Globally, Acting Locally, these reports show that our problems are deep and systemic. If we missed the boat in 1996, as Brad Joe says, and we did, we were too euphoric, too overwhelmed with how wonderful it was to have achieved certain kinds of things. We didn't see the problems coming at us the way they have really, really entrenched themselves in this last year under COVID. I think we've got to do something much more rigorous, much deeper about the systemic problems that the sustainability of journalism poses to us. And I'm going to suggest that there actually are problems of that kind of nature. So that's what I want to sort of add into the conversation today. I'm very grateful to have been asked to give my thought to the work that has been done by the panel, and very impressed with the sort of largeness and the systemic nature that that report has taken on of our media system. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Anthea. At this point, I'd just like to check if there's any point of clarifications before we open up comments on the floor from our panelists. If there's any last point you'd like to make. Cool. I will take that as a no. I would like to invite Dr. Glenda Daniels for comment, and then open up the conversation to the rest of the floor.
Okay, thank you very much, Monica. And I want to say, as always, I hang on every word that Bra Joe says, and it was fantastic, including everything that Bra Rich spoke about, and indeed what Anthea just said about systemic problems. So I'm not going to be too long, because I'm sure we want to have a discussion. But just to say that, yes, 1996 presented an opportunity which we didn't go forward with. Then the second opportunity was also the Press Freedom Commission with Justice Paya Langa, which ended up being reform in its nature. And I think this is a third opportunity, the conference that's coming up now, where we take the recommendations from, there are far too many recommendations to take on automatically and overnight. But some of the things that are coming across from everybody, all three speakers, including Monica's presentation, I'll just go through very quickly about number one, the public interest, the public function of journalism that we need to discuss vis-a-vis class issues, language issues. We can't just talk about diversity in terms of race and gender. We have to talk about the class component, how separate journalism is and has become more and more elitist. And we've always avoided this issue for as long as I can remember. We need to take that up as to how we can be more part of communities rather than above communities, looking down upon communities and reporting on all sorts of issues in ways as though we're separate from this, poverty issues, for instance, starvation issues. So that's the one thing. Number two, in all of our discussions and in all of our seminars and in the great work that SANEF does, the Press Council and the inquiry itself, we are not engaged with owners and media managers at all, and they are part of the problem, if not one of the largest problems. They seem to get away with everything. And the reason why I say this is, for instance, with the Press Council, the biggest issue has been over the last decade and maybe more, the issue of right to replies. It's a consistent theme that's come up. And part of the problem with this is that owners and managers have canned the sub-editing function. So it's all very well to have fact-checking organizations. They play an important role. They have been fantastic. But we do need those sub-editors back in the newsrooms. We really do. Then the next point is a total overhaul of how we do journalism. It can't happen overnight, but a 5-year plan must incorporate pressure on the owners and management structures. We can't just let them off the hook. If you look at this webinar right now, for instance, are there any managers in here of media who have taken an interest in this issue? Are there any owners here? I don't think so. We've got 33 participants. I don't think they're here. You know, the way media companies are looking at things at the moment, it's from the point of view of innovation towards making more money. And this innovation seems to be about selling things and having webinars, and you can call that another elitist convocation, and not really dealing with substantive issues. And I think with Anthea, she was talking about systemic problems. I think this could be one of the systemic problems. And they themselves are the ones who are putting pressure on the newsrooms. They are putting pressure on the editors and news editors to compete with social media. So they're part of the problem. They're part of the problem as to why journalism has now, rather than watching what's happening on social media, actually chasing social media, because the owners and the management structures want those clicks and the algorithms. So yeah, I mean, I don't want to repeat everybody else's points. That all the points were fantastic. I just want to say that we mustn't lose sight of the fact that we need to put that kind of pressure, and let's discuss that at the upcoming conference. Thanks very much.
Great, thank you so much, Glenda. If some of you don't know, Glenda is also the author of the book entitled Power and Lost in South African Media, and I think it's a must-read for anyone that's a journalist or a manager or an owner. I would like to now see if Ms. Rama is also invite her to speak. She works with Gender Links, and I'm calling her Ms. Rama, but she was my former lecturer, and I struggle to use her first name even now.
I'm trying to decide whether I should be embarrassed or not, Monica. Thank you so much. It's an interesting discussion, and much has been said. Anthea said that, you know, we've had the conversations about gender and diversity, so she'd like to approach it from a different space. Well, that is true, and I think the real question we have to ask ourselves is, despite all those conversations, why haven't we moved? In our recent study on Brajo, you know, we've had arguments about our research before, but the research continues. And we did a survey of the South African and regional media on the proportion of women sources. And tragically, it still remains at 21%. And I did a calculation of if and when we'll reach tragedy, and sadly, I will no longer be alive. So the question is, and it's a very real question, I think when we think of ethics, the question of diversity, and of course my interest around gender and race as well, is very, very important. Because what constitutes ethical reporting in the end is really about how we represent and who we choose to represent in our stories, who we speak to, who we don't speak to. Equally important. Who don't we consider when we write these stories? And I'm afraid it's gotten, you know, when we did the analysis, in some instances, it's gotten better. In others, it's gotten very bad. If you look at election coverage, for example, and we are going towards an election in May. I'm not sure if any of you knows the dates, but I haven't heard when that is going to happen. We know sometime in May. Most of the coverage was around were politicians, were people who were speaking on behalf of parties or government. Little or no coverage actually had the citizen. And that's tragic, especially now that we're heading towards local government elections, because that's all about service delivery. That's a sphere of government closest to the people. And if we don't speak to citizens, we're not getting the full story. That's a massive ethical issue. Whose voices are we choosing to put out there? And unfortunately, even now, it's not women. And that is, I'm actually not sure. We're in the process of finalizing our 2021-2025 strategy. And we're trying to understand what needs to happen. What do we need to do? How do we break this impasse? Because we all make the right noises, we all say the right things, but we don't do the right things. And for me, that is a very critical question. And yes, it's not just about practitioners, it's about owners, it's about the whole gamut. The ethical bodies, you know, what are we going to do? It's not okay in 2021 for us still to be sitting with 21% women sources. I don't think there's anybody on the score who'll say that is fine, we can continue. It is inherently unethical that our news is so biased, because that's what it amounts to. It's bias. I think I'll stop there, Monica.
Thank you very much, Ms. Rama. Really appreciate that insight, and very important. And you're absolutely right. In 2021, 20% is ridiculous. I mean, there's no better way to describe it. Thank you. I would like to now invite any comments from anyone else on the floor that would like to weigh in on this conversation.
So much, and thank you, SANEF, for putting this study together. You know, I had a look at the report, and I had a look at the recommendations, and I had a particular interest because I served on the board of the Media Development and Diversity Agency recently for 3 difficult years when the organization was in a period of change and trying to improve its governance. And you know, I mean, I think SANEF cites the report, cites sources, but hasn't really spoken to any of the board members. I'm no longer on the board, but any of the board members or the executive in the report to try and get a better sense of what it takes to run a funding organization. And I would like to recommend that more focus be put on that. You know why? Because if the discussion is around sustainability and diversity, chances are that government is not going to create a different media diversity agency for enabling media support and creating an enabling environment. Chances are it'll look at that structure to try and fulfill an even bigger mandate. And I think, you know, I've got a lot of things to say, and I won't take up this time. I have a lot of things to say about what it takes, why it is the way it is, and why it's so important for SANEF in particular and other organizations that are promoting media diversity to look at the mechanics of running such an organization, what the learnings are from the previous failures, but also the successes. I mean, I think the gender disparity within the community media sector was also picked up by the research, you know. But so I'm just encouraging a little bit more attention. Rather than looking away from an organization that is emerging from a fairly dysfunctional period of time, very similar to the SABC and all the other state-linked entities that get taxpayers' money to serve, but really look at the mechanics of how that organization functions and what are the limitations within that act. Because I know that unless you change legislation, policy, and so forth to grow and really take a stake in these organizations, things aren't going to significantly change. So I just thought I'd share that.
Excellent. Thank you so much for sharing, Martina. Is there anyone else that'd like to share before we move on to the next part of our session?
Monica, I just wanted to comment on what Martina has said about MDDA. At the beginning of our inquiry, we debated a lot on whether we should proactively go to organizations and talk to them, or we should invite them to come to us, or we should let SANEF alert them that there is such an inquiry. Also, we were limited by the terms of reference because we were specifically looking into ethical issues rather than bigger diverse issues. So if issues of diversity, which Glenda and Anthea were talking about, were impacting on ethics, it would have been interesting for us to look at. But we did listen to a lot of people who spoke about issues of diversity and ethics. So I thought I should just put that on the table and say, we didn't ignore MDDA and other organizations. We simply didn't have time, but also our terms of reference was a little bit limited. But we did ask for submissions from a lot of organizations, and some did, and some didn't. And also, I think I would like to talk about the issue of owners. There was a lament earlier about whether any of the owners and managers are attending this webinar to be able to hear what we are talking about. I guess it's a bigger issue because the owners see themselves as the people who have made a commercial obligation and therefore needs needs their money, needs to make money. And so they let the editors actually do the job. So I think it's a commitment of both the editors and the owners to work together. For example, when we went to go and see ENCA, it was both the editors, the journalists, and the owners and the management. And we separately had a discussion with some of the shareholders. So it was quite interesting. But with the other organization, we were ignored. So that's the challenge that we have. I guess when it comes to what Glenda is saying on the issues of how long are we supposed to talk and not implement, it's exactly that. What is the commitment between managers and owners to do something about it? I thought I should just say that, Monica.
Great. Thank you for that clarification, Rich. Much appreciated. At this stage, I would like to invite you all to join us for our next session as we separate into various breakout rooms. The intention of these rooms is to focus on specific issues forwarded by the discussants and the panelists. Please also find the leading questions on the chat in the chat box. Each breakaway room should report back with practical opinions to take to conference. I would also like to ask each break room to please nominate a chair to report back to the group. These sessions are going to be recorded, and I would like to ask SANEF members to please volunteer to chair these individual break rooms. Thank you. Thank you so much. I hope those breakout rooms were interesting and we have some good ideas and debates there. Is everyone back in the room? Is everyone back here? I think so. Great, cool. I would like to hand over to Glenda Daniels, who will lead the one submission and discussion.
Okay, so we're just summarizing now what we discussed, Monica, and what possible recommendations we can do for the conference. So I'll try and be quick because I think we've only got 5 minutes left. Number 1, language. Number 2, gender. Number 3, class, elitism, and LGBTQI plus issues, and the public broadcaster promotion, and community partnerships for sharing stories. And the training of diversity issues, it was mentioned, hasn't worked that well in the past. We need to do something better. And regarding queer issues, I mean, hopefully you can come to one of our classes. This is an aside thing. We do queer theory and media studies, but that's just an aside. We need to bring that in, maybe a blend with academia into, you know, to not just blending with community and twinning with that, but maybe academe can play a role also. I didn't share this in the group because I was busy writing. And Kate mentioned that diversity and the mapping exercise that was that came about in the recommendations from the inquiry. We need to look at audiences vis-a-vis the class issues and content. A concrete recommendation could be looking at this mapping exercise. SANEF can't do this alone, but with the MDDA or another organization, if the MDDA is on its feet and can't help, but we need diversity from the bottom up approach. And Nikki also mentioned the class issue. Monica also mentioned class and mainstream. So Nikki's issue was that we are very much middle-class newsrooms, and that is the lens of privilege, which we need to think about, how we fill this gap. And, you know, the issue about talking down to people and taking what people are saying seriously, talking with people rather than at people. We are talking about people. We are assuming too much about what people think, what people feel, because we think we know. You know, this is a big issue. Speaking to poor and not actually speaking about the poor and not actually talking to the poor in their stories. So, you know, and it's not always about getting experts from academics or NGOs. What about talking to the community people who are leading communities? Anthea made very good points about the public broadcaster and language and how we need to support and encourage the issue, how we need to ensure that the public broadcaster becomes better run and better managed, because this plays a huge role in terms of what we've just been speaking about vis-a-vis language and class issues. Martina also about what is public interest journalism. I think in newsrooms, as she was saying, in newsrooms, with owners, with management, with journalists, they don't understand this concept. What does this mean? We could actually, in the conference going forward, take this up, have somebody deliver a 10-minute suggestion about what does this mean? What does publics mean in terms of public interest journalism? Then we can promote multilingualism. There needs to be a pointed effort to look at all the policy papers, white papers that have come up, monitor this. How has this been implemented, if it's been implemented at all? And Kate, I mentioned already, talked about the partnership between community media and mainstream media. How do we actually do this in practice by bringing the two together to, you know, in terms of resources that community media just doesn't have. Rich mentioned the issue of, in the discussions with community media, how diversity has an impact because people are overlooked, people feel they're overlooked because of class issues. And he mentioned the issue of who is your audience that came up. And how do you address different audiences when people say, well, your issue belongs to the Sowetan, your issue would come from, you know, be in the Sunday Times, and your issue in the Mail and Guardian, because people seem, you know, deal with specific audiences and then cater for content to specific audiences. Anthea mentioned the issue about the Crocod's Mail one as a fantastic example of how issues arose from there and then were taken up in mainstream media as well. And then lastly, Monica spoke about how news editors actually need support. This lends itself very much to the issue of diversity and freedom. I hope I've got all those 15 points that I made down well. I've got them written down. Obviously, what I'll do is I'll type them out and send it to you, Monica. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Glenda. That was perfect and excellent as always. Thank you very much. Thank you. I'd like to move over to the next group. Who was tasked with delivering the recommendations or the discussion from that group, from the second group?
I think that's my group. Were there just two groups?
Yes, there were just two groups. Correct.
I'm not Judy, by the way. It's Mkhondo.
Hi, Mkhondo. Hi, Mkhondo. Lovely to see your face there, madam.
Sorry, I'm in the car. Long story, but let me take you through the team and the deliberations there. Just in terms of what are the gaps and in the recommendations. There was concern from Kubi and also supported by Taryn as well, just in terms of looking at the curriculum at institutions and whether it's still relevant to the industry and the challenges that it's facing, and whether that close collaboration still exists. And going forward, should it not be something that we look at, especially given that looking at the level of education that kids are getting currently. The other gap, or maybe part gap, but also part of what we should be possibly taking the conversation further, was Brajo talking around the Daily Maverick submissions around the paywall. And I know that this is a conversation that's been had even as we were preparing our first report that we are looking at, is whether something that is behind a paywall, can it actually be in the public interest? And there was a suggestion that we need to look at this much deeper, and especially if we're taking the issue forward around looking at some state assistance or government assistance. Where do institutions with paywalls and come in versus information being in the public interest? Taryn asked a question around the independent group, and that the report in essence didn't really answer what happens when a massive media institution like the independent group is no longer part of the press council, and what should be the answer there. There wasn't really an answer to this question in terms of what should be the recommendation, but more identified as a glaring gap. And I know that it was also a conversation that was had quite intensely at SANEF Council when this report was actually discussed. And one of the recommendations is that even with media houses that do have internal ombuds, it should be important that they still are part of the press council or the other external oversight groups, and that is critical. And basically something that needs to be perhaps something that emerges at conference to say that, you know, internal oversight should never replace the national mechanisms that we have of oversight. Brajo, in supporting that, was basically talking around how owners associations themselves have collapsed, and part of it is competition and also the paranoia that exists, where one media owner believes that others are out to get the other, and we know the PSS has collapsed. And the other question is what happens to institutions like ABC going forward? Will they actually still be covered? And there was also Amina looking at asking the question around the proposal for an ethics chair. I think that's something that's there in the Sunday Times recommendations, just around funding an ethics chair. And the question was, it's not quite clear what an ethics chair would then do, just basically creating another mechanism when ethics is supposed to be a very core of who we are as journalists. What does an ethics chair come in and then do? And then we had quite a debate around it, and I was asking the question of, is there space for a ethics, a monitoring of ethical lapses as part of this 5-year plan that we want to embark on? And I think Amina came back to talk about, could we have an annual report around an ethics barometer, for example, which doesn't necessarily become a whole new institution, but rather, you know, you get a master's student or, you know, an institution to basically tabulate from existing sources, whether it's the press, the BTCSA, etc., and we create an ethics barometer. I really support, I think the word ethics barometer and something that's an annual measure really resonated with me, because at least it means that we're able to track ourselves and whether we are making progress. The last thing that I think I want to mention, I see we're also quickly running out of time, is that Brajo had mentioned something around mediation and how do we work together to save the industry. And basically I gave insight into what we are trying to propose to the presidency around a presidential task team that would bring everybody under the same roof. And I just supported that that could be the answer to just making sure that all the players, owners, marketers, corporate South Africa, everybody is in one room in terms of how to save the industry. I think that's that.
Great, thank you, Shati, that's excellent. Thank you, everybody. We've come to the end of this session. I'd like to thank everybody for giving your time participating in this. I know 2 hours out of anyone's day is a lot to commit to. So it's a massive appreciation to every single person, and a big thank you to all our panelists for being a part of this conversation and giving us extremely valuable insight to take forward as we move ahead to the conference, a very important conference in May.